In 1964, a computer went on sale inside a plus-shaped cabinet weighing about 12,000 pounds. Control Data Corporation of Minneapolis sold it, and it was the fastest machine on Earth for the next 5 years. The designer was Seymour Cray, 31 when the company started, working on pads of quarter-inch graph paper. In 1972, Cray quit, and the president of Control Data put $250,000 into his new company. 10 years later, that company was one of 3 breaking the mainframe business at Control Data. Cray was not fired, and the split was not bitter. The man who stayed wrote the check for the man who left. Control Data began in July of 1957, when a dozen Sperry Rand engineers in Minneapolis resigned. They sold stock to raise $600,000 and rented space in a warehouse. One of them was William Norris, born in a small Nebraska town in 1911. Cray wanted to go with them, and did not. He stayed at Sperry Rand to finish a prototype for a Navy system, and joined Control Data after that. A business history of the company describes him then as the brightest computer designer in the world. The machine that made the company was the 6600. The cabinet stood in the shape of a plus sign, with a pump and a heat exchanger in the outer 18 inches of each arm. Freon circulated inside and dumped the heat into a chilled water supply. The whole thing drew 30 kilowatts. Cray had told Norris that something had to change, or he would leave. Norris decided he could not lose him and let him build a laboratory anywhere he wanted. Cray picked Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin, where he had been born. The distance was the point. It was too far from St. Paul for a quick visit, and far enough that long-distance charges would stop most phone calls. It was still close enough for a real visit or a board meeting. The 6600 went on sale in September of 1964. The price in the middle of that decade was about $2,370,000. More than 100 of them sold. Sit down at the console for a moment. 2 screens face you instead of the switches and blinking lamps common on consoles of that era. You type on a keyboard, and the screens draw letters in 3 sizes and simple pictures. The numbers are the reason IBM noticed. The 6600 ran at 10 megahertz, roughly 10 times the clock of other machines for sale. It beat the previous record holder, an IBM machine called Stretch, by a factor of 3. On the 28th of August, 1963, the chief executive of IBM sent his employees a memo about it. Thomas Watson Jr. wrote that the laboratory building this system had only 34 people in it, including the janitor. 14 of them were engineers and 4 were programmers. That was the whole advantage, and an advantage that small can walk out the door. If you want more of this, subscribe. Every week this channel takes one American technology company apart and reads what it left in writing. Control Data took IBM to court, walked away with one of its subsidiaries, and still ended up split in 2. None of that has come up yet. Set the 2 organizations side by side. On one side, a laboratory in Wisconsin with 34 people in it, 14 of them engineers and 4 of them programmers. On the other, the largest computer company on Earth. That was the comparison the memo made. The memo did not stop at the head count. Watson set that 34-person laboratory against the vast development activities of his own company. Then he wrote that he could not understand how IBM had lost its industry leadership by letting someone else offer the most powerful computer in the world. That page sits in a museum exhibit now, supplied by the IBM archive itself. Put a number on the speed. The 6600 reached about 3 million floating-point operations a second on a 60-bit processor running at 10 megahertz. It held the world record from 1964 to 1969, when Control Data itself took the record away with the 7600. The new machine was built for 10 times the speed of the old one. Sperry Rand was the company they had all left. Norris joined the Navy in 1941 and was put into a code-breaking unit. He was in his mid-40s when Control Data opened in a rented warehouse. Cray was 31. Growth came fast. Within 5 years, Control Data was the fourth largest computer maker in the world. Within 8 years, it employed 10,000 people and sold $160 million a year. By 1970, revenue passed $1 billion, and the payroll reached 30,000. Inside that cabinet were about 6,000 cordwood modules. Each one carried 64 silicon transistors. The chassis were around 8 inches thick, hinged near the middle. So a technician opened them like a book. At the crossing point of the plus sign, the space filled up with cable. The whole assembly weighed about 12,000 pounds. Peripherals meant the parts of a computer that are not the processor. Disks and tapes, and the machinery that moves data in and out. Control Data built them for its own systems, and it built disks meant to work with IBM machines. The money did not come from the fast machines. It came from peripherals, and in 1980 that division held half of the world market. In 1983, it sold $1.5 billion worth. It was one of the largest and most profitable parts of the company. The network came early, too. In 1968, Control Data linked 7 of its 6600s into a service called Cybernet. You did not have to own one of these machines to use it. You bought time on somebody else. There was a machine in Palo Alto and one in Los Angeles. Houston and Minneapolis had one each. Washington and New York and Boston finished the list. It was sold as a service rather than as a machine. IBM answered the 6600 with an announcement. It said a new System 360 model, the Model 92, would be as fast as the Control Data machine. The Model 92 did not exist. Orders for the 6600 dropped sharply anyway. Norris filed an antitrust suit in December of 1968. The charge was that IBM had promoted a computer that did not exist in order to force Control Data out of business. The case took 5 years. It ended in a settlement in January of 1973. IBM handed over Service Bureau Corporation, a data services company with about 20,000 customers around the world. One source values that settlement at $80 million. Another says IBM sold the subsidiary to Control Data for $16 million. Both numbers are in print, and they do not agree. The lawsuit is the strange part of this story. A company that started in a warehouse took the biggest computer company in the world to court over an antitrust claim and won something. Peak year was 1981. Earnings hit $289 million. The highest the company ever posted. Nearly 60,000 people worked for Control Data around the world that year. In Minnesota alone, the headcount ran above 25,000 full-time workers between 1981 and 1984. Another part of the company was building something with nothing to do with speed. It was called Play-Doh, and it taught school. The terminals used a plasma display with a characteristic orange glow. The screen held 512 by 512 dots and kept the image in the display itself. There was more on the front of that terminal. A touch panel of 16 by 16 infrared beams sat over the glass, which meant a student could answer by touching the screen. Color images came from microfiche projected from behind. One terminal cost about $12,000 in 1972. By the early 1980s, Play-Doh had $600 million in it. The company started advertising the service heavily, and the reason appears to have been growing dissent inside the company about the size of the project. A business history of the period puts it plainly. Play-Doh was largely unsuccessful. The same history says the other half of what Norris was doing worked. Inner-city employment was far more successful, in its words. Both statements are about the same man in the same years. The 8600 was supposed to follow the 7600 and keep the record inside the company. Cray designed it with the parts packed so tightly that it could not be cooled. The solder joints ran hot and the reliability fell apart. Cray wanted to throw the design out and start again. Norris would not pay for two things at once. Control Data was also building a machine called Star, and the budget covered one of them. Norris offered to keep the 8600 alive at a low level until Star shipped. Cray would not work that way. There were two supercomputer programs, one budget, and two men who disagreed about which one to stop. In 1972, Cray left Control Data. A year later, he started Cray Research in a new laboratory on the same Chippewa property. Norris put $250,000 of startup money into it. The account of the split calls it fairly amicable. The first product was the Cray one. It was clearly faster than every other computer then running, and the first system sold inside a month for $8.8 million. That was 1976. 4 years earlier, the same designer had been an employee. That was the first product Cray Research ever sold. Control Data had spent that decade deciding whether to fund one supercomputer or two. The man who left had already shipped his. The next part comes down as a story rather than as a record. The company asked him for a 1-year plan and a 5-year plan, and he wrote 2 lines. 5-year goal, build the biggest computer in the world. 1-year goal, 1/5 of the above. His hobby was digging a tunnel under his house. He said that while he was digging, the elves would come to him with solutions to his problem. His design tool was a pad of 8.5 by 11-inch paper with faint 1/4-inch squares. Norris himself did not walk into that laboratory without an invitation. The ground moved under the money side of the business. Japanese manufacturers came into peripherals, and the technology turned over, and the cost of making IBM-compatible disks climbed past what Control Data would pay. Control Data walked out of that market and wrote off $130 million. The share numbers tell it without help. Half the world market in 1980. 23% by 1984. That was the bread and butter division of the company, cut in half in 4 years. Those two figures are the 1980s at this company. Here are 2 records laid out side by side. A university exhibit on the company writes that some have blamed the upheaval on the wide-ranging social activism of Norris and his focus on the Plato education system. A business history of the company opens its account of the crisis with the peripherals division and the drop from half the market to 23%. Both things were happening in the same building. In those same years, Norris pushed job training programs and prison education and small business consulting, along with inner-city industrial parks and financial help for the small farmer. The market share was falling while that was going on. Neither document proves the other one wrong. The exhibit that repeats the blame also records that the network this company ran had more centers than ARPANET in 1971. Both facts are in the same short text. Nothing in it says which one explains the ending. 1985 is where the numbers turn. Sales were $3.7 billion, and the loss was about $570 million. Another $265 million went out in 1986. In the autumn of 1985, Control Data could not pay its short-term bank loans, and a company that size does not hide that for long. From that point, the story is asset sales and job cuts for 10 years. 1989 was worse in one way. The loss reached $680 million, and sales had fallen under $3 billion. 8 years earlier, this company had cleared $289 million in profit. Norris stayed until 1986. He was 75 years old when he formally retired, 29 years after the warehouse. The company had posted losses in 1985 and 1986 that added to more than $800 million. The supercomputer subsidiary went first. ETA Systems sold 7 machines cooled with liquid nitrogen and 27 smaller air-cooled ones. The design never fully matured. In 1989, ETA laid off most of its employees. Minnesota had carried more than 25,000 full-time control data jobs in the early 80s. That is a different figure from the 60,000 worldwide, and the two are worth keeping apart. What was left was sold in pieces. Here are the prices, in order. In 1973, IBM handed over a subsidiary with 20,000 customers to settle the antitrust case. In 1989, Seagate bought the disk business, Imprimis, for $250 million in cash. It also paid $10.7 million in Seagate stock and a promissory note for $50 million. In 1992, the company could not find an investor. Nobody would fund a corporation whose interests ran from proprietary mainframes to Unix to military and government software to a lottery business. To avoid bankruptcy, Control Data split into 2 independent companies. They were named Ceridian and Control Data Systems. A company with nearly 60,000 employees in 1981 could not find a single investor in 1992. The disk business had already gone to Seagate. What was left had to be cut in 2 before anyone would take it. The lottery business in that list was really there, sitting in the same sentence as the mainframes. That was the description of a company nobody would buy whole. The plus-shaped cabinet with Freon running through it was by then almost 30 years old. What you can find now is the paperwork. The Computer History Museum holds a photograph taken at Lawrence Livermore, cataloged with a number, showing that console and the machine standing behind it. The company that made IBM write that memo is a catalog entry with an accession number. Some of it outlived the company. Cray Research built machines that kept setting the record. In the 1980s, it stood as one of 3 competitors squeezing the mainframe business at Control Data. The other 2 were Digital Equipment and IBM. One of the 3 had been started with money from Control Data. The record itself moved, but did not stop. Control Data took the title away from itself in 1969 with the 7600. Cray took it again from outside the company in 1976. Both of the machines that beat the 6600 came out of the same laboratory, run by the same designer. Cybernet is the other piece that outlived the design. In 1971, that service had 20 network centers. ARPANET, the network the internet grew out of, had 18. 7 of the fastest machines in the world were already wired together and sold as a service. And there was a screen with a touch panel on it in 1972. 16 by 16 infrared beams, a plasma display, and pictures pulled off microfiche behind the glass. That was a school terminal, built by the company that was about to fall apart. Seymour Cray was born in Chippewa Falls on the 28th of September, 1925. In September of 1996, he was merging his Jeep Cherokee onto Interstate 25 in Colorado when another driver tried to pass him. The car rolled. Cray was hurt, badly. The police wrote up the other driver for careless driving. Cray died on the 5th of October, 1996, 2 weeks after the accident and 1 week after his 71st birthday. The design work had all been done on quarter-inch graph paper. IBM could not buy what Control Data had. What Control Data had was 34 people in one building, and one of them could quit. If you ever ran a job on a 6600, say so below. If you sat at that console with the 2 screens, say that too. If you bought time on Cybernet. Or if your first computer lesson came off an orange plasma screen, we want the year and the place. Tell us what the machine was doing when you were in the room. Next week, a company that shipped a product it knew was broken and printed the list of what was wrong with it.